People talk about war, we consider its cost. Imagine the moment. The war is over. Not formally, but truly over. No shooting, no shells exploding. On television, words about victory, ceasefire, or a new phase. People go out into the streets, some return home, and some realize for the first time that there's nowhere left to return to. And it's at this moment, not immediately, not publicly, but deep inside, a question arises that no one speaks aloud. What was all this for? This question isn't asked at the beginning of war. At the beginning, it's simply impossible to hear. It's drowned out by slogans, fear, sense of threat, and certainty that there's no other way. At the beginning of any war, they always talk about necessity, about defense, about justice, about the future. But war doesn't end with slogans. It ends with consequences. And between these 2 points, there's an abyss into which millions of human lives fall. If you rewind time and look at the major wars of recent decades, a strange pattern emerges. They started differently, but ended the same way. Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Syria, different continents, different cultures, different pretexts. But the outcome is always similar. Destroyed cities, traumatized societies, and years of attempts to explain what was actually achieved. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq was presented as an urgent measure. The world heard words about weapons of mass destruction, about a global threat, about the need to act quickly before it was too late. It sounded convincing, alarming, and decisive. Years later, official investigations confirmed there were no weapons, no stockpiles, no programs, no threat for which the war was unleashed. None of it existed. Instead, there was a country that lost hundreds of thousands of people, a region plunged into chaos, and a chain of conflicts whose consequences the world still feels today. And the question that was considered almost treasonous in 2003 sounds inevitable today. What for? Afghanistan lasted 20 years. 20 years of talk about fighting terrorism, about protecting democracy, about building a new future. 20 years of war into which trillions of dollars and thousands of soldiers' lives were invested. And then, a sudden exit. And the country returned in a matter of weeks to almost exactly where it all started. The same forces in power, the same fears among the population, the same shattered expectations. Only there were fewer people left who could ask the question, what for? The Balkans in the 90s. A war explained by historical justice, defense of nations, and restoration of order. The outcome, millions of refugees, destroyed cities, and a region that has lived with unhealed trauma for decades. There they still argue not about the future, but about the past. Because the war gave no answer, it only fixed the division. Syria, an even more vivid example. A conflict that began with slogans about change and then turned into a complex knot of interests of dozens of players. At some point, it became difficult even to formulate what it was continuing for. But each day continued to increase the price. The dead, refugees, destroyed cities, a generation of children who grew up amid war. And again, silence around the main question. Notice one detail. Wars always have a clear beginning, but almost never have a clear meaning at the end. Victory is declared, agreements are signed, but a sense of completion doesn't come, because no official document answers the main human question. What did this war give to ordinary people? Research by international human rights organizations shows, after major military conflicts, the level of trust in states and institutions falls even among the winning sides. Society becomes more polarized, more traumatized, more vulnerable to radical ideas. War rarely solves the stated problems, but always creates new ones, more complex and long-term. And here uncomfortable thoughts appear, from which people usually try to escape. What if wars are not fought for the goals they speak of aloud? What if the real goals lie in a completely different plane? Economic, political, geopolitical, and the people who lose homes, health, and loved ones turn out to be not subjects of history, but its expendable material? But even if we accept this as given, another layer remains. War changes not only countries, It changes the very scale of values. In peacetime, life seems self-evident. War turns it into statistics, into numbers, into reports. And when war ends, society has to relearn to look at a person not as a resource, but as a value. This is precisely why the most dangerous moment is not the beginning of war, and not even its peak. The most dangerous moment is when everything ends and the question what for remains unanswered. Because if it's not asked, the next war becomes only a matter of time. And history shows this again and again. This channel is not about news and not about reports. It's about what remains beyond the frame of official statements, about how every war sooner or later comes down not to maps and strategies, but to human life and its price. And before moving forward to causes, benefits, and mechanisms, we need to honestly record. Almost every war ultimately leaves humanity with the same question. What was all this for? And if we don't start looking for an answer to it, not an emotional, not a propagandistic, but an honest one, this question will be asked again and again by other people, in other cities, under other bombardments. When war formally ends, it rarely ends in society's consciousness. On paper, agreements are signed. On screen, news of ceasefire. But in reality, destruction remains that cannot be erased. And it's precisely here that the most subtle and dangerous mechanism begins to operate. The mechanism of retrospective justification. Politicians, media, analysts create a story where war already has meaning, though real victories most often never existed. In Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, they first spoke about weapons of mass destruction, then about liberating the country and opportunities for democracy. In reality, the country plunged into chaos. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Infrastructure was destroyed. The region remains unstable to this day. But the official version creates the illusion that military actions had meaning. This is an example of how war receives retrospective justification. Not for history, but for a society that must accept what happened. Afghanistan, a different example but the same mechanism. 20 years of operations, trillions of dollars, hundreds of thousands dead. In 2021, there was a rapid fall of the regime that Western countries tried to support. Official versions explain this as fighting terrorism and state building. Reality was harsher. The war left a generation of children without a normal future, and a country where stability never appeared. Economic and military reports created an appearance of success, but the facts scream the opposite. The Balkans in the 90s show how several parallel versions of events are created in war. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, each side formed its own narrative about the goals and causes of the conflict. International organizations, including the UN and NATO, created global stories that replaced local causes. The outcome, millions of refugees, destroyed cities, and a generation that grew up in trauma. Myths formed faster than consequences could be assessed, and they still hold the memory of war in a convenient frame. Syria, an example where rewriting meaning became systemic. A conflict that began as an internal crisis turned in a few years into a field of interest for dozens of international players. Each day brought new deaths and destruction, but official and media explanations changed. Democracy, security, fighting terror, fighting ISIS, protecting the population. The real cost of war, hundreds of thousands dead, millions of refugees, destroyed cities, remains off camera and meaning is created artificially. It's precisely this mechanism that keeps society in the illusion that everything happening has logical and moral justification. The mechanism of justifying wars is not only words and slogans. It's bureaucratic reports, memoranda, laws, analytical studies that turn consequences into results. After Iraq and Afghanistan, dozens of official documents claim that war goals were achieved. Financial reports and casualty statistics formatted chaos into tables and graphs, creating an illusion of control. This works in all conflicts. Formal logic replaces real tragedy. In all this process, economics plays a key role. War brings income to private companies, contractors, arms manufacturers, logistics, and analytical firms. In Afghanistan, for example, tens of billions of dollars in expenses went to servicing the army and contractors. And this money became part of the justification. If resources are invested, then actions were necessary and effective. This is how economic legitimization of war is formed, when the very cost creates an illusion of necessity. Media create a second level of justification. Reports, news, documentaries form a narrative where there are heroes and villains, events are ordered, and real tragedy hides between the lines. Pew Research Center shows that most people perceive conflicts through media, trusting visual and verbal versions, even if they distort reality. As a result, society receives an explanation convenient for perception, but often far from the truth. Wars are rewritten in history, textbooks, films, and veteran interviews. The Balkans are a vivid example. Each side created its own version of the war, convenient for itself, which diverged from documentary reality. Each person sees their own tragedy, but collective memory is formed differently, and the meaning of war that is imposed on society rarely coincides with what real people experience. The paradox is that the stronger the consequences of war manifest, the higher the need for their justification. Millions dead, destroyed cities, ruined lives. All this requires explanation. Leaders form versions of right war that simultaneously serve as instruments of legitimation and psychological defense for society. The principle is simple. If war happened, it means it was necessary. Society actively participates in this process. People seek meaning where there is none. They believe in noble goals, accept stories about heroes and villains, repeat slogans imposed on them. Harvard studies show that such collective agreement helps psychologically survive, but postpones real assessment of consequences. As a result, new wars and each new conflict begins with the same illusions. This time we're right, this time it will be different. The meaning of war is created not at the moment of its beginning, but post factum. It's born after cities and lives are destroyed, when consequences are obvious but impossible to change. Politicians, analysts, companies, and media form a version of events convenient for themselves but incompatible with the experience of victims. And only understanding this mechanism allows us to honestly look at war, its cost and consequences, asking the main question that repeats again and again. What was all this for? War never asks for consent. It comes to cities suddenly. Sirens, explosions, smoke over houses. People don't have time to understand who's right, who's wrong, who will live, and who won't. They see only consequences. Destroyed streets, empty schools, hospitals without light and water. And when the smoke clears, only one question remains that cannot be ignored. Why did this happen and who profited from it? The paradox of war is that it's simultaneously chaos and plan. For those who initiate it, it's a tool of influence and profit. Arms manufacturers, contractors, analytical centers, political elites, all gain benefits. For ordinary people, war is destruction and loss, trauma and fear. In Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and dozens of other places, the world sees the same picture. Someone gets resources and power, and someone pays the highest price: their life, health, their children's future. War creates its own narrative that often has nothing in common with reality. It forms heroes and villains, simplifies events so the world can understand it. Media, reports, official statements turn chaos into a plot in which every number, every city, every life has its place. But not in objective history, but in history created for justification. And this justification is born after consequences are obvious, and it's already impossible to cancel them. But consequences don't remain only numbers in reports. They shape the psychology and values of entire generations. Children who grew up amid destruction see the world as a dangerous place where life is measured by politics and economics. Sociologists and psychologists call this collective trauma that passes on through generations. Fear gives birth to consent for new conflicts because new wars are easily justified by old logic. This time we're right. Thus, with frightening accuracy, history repeats itself again and again. War changes not only cities and lives, but the very value of human life. In statistics of the dead, in lists of destroyed homes, in figures of economic losses, the value of each person is lost. Each home, each child, each fate turns into a performance indicator, into a report that reassures those who manage the conflict. For ordinary people, what remains is emptiness that cannot be measured and cannot be compensated. But it's precisely here that space for awareness appears. Because if we start looking at war not as statistics or official versions, but as a system of consequences and benefits, we'll see its true laws. Laws that repeat, the higher the price for society, the stronger the justification from those who profit from war. The more destruction, the more convincing the formulations about necessity, justice, humanitarian mission sound. Meanwhile, the meaning of war is born post factum, benefits are distributed, and society is left to pay. Who really wins? Politicians strengthen power, companies get contracts and profits, media form versions of events, ordinary people pay the price. In Afghanistan, thousands of children saw their parents die. In Iraq, millions were forced to leave their homes. In Syria, entire cities disappeared from the map. And for them, the question what for becomes not philosophical, but sharp as a knife. This very question is the core of what we do on this channel. It's simple and terrifying. Why do wars repeat? Why do some suffer while others win? Why is the meaning of war formed not at the moment of its beginning, but when destruction has already occurred? The answer, unfortunately, offers no consolation, but it gives understanding. If we stop asking these questions, if we accept official versions as truth, history will repeat again and again. Not somewhere out there, but in our cities, schools, homes. The prices will be the same, but the scale even higher. And this is precisely why we make this channel. To see war honestly, to show consequences, to not let justifications obscure reality, so that every viewer can ask themselves the question, what for, before the first shot is fired, not after homes become ruins. War is always a gap between promise and reality, between words and actions, between life and death. We show this gap, we record the price, we ask questions, and until society stops accepting wars as inevitability, until it learns to see who gains benefits and who pays the price, each new war will repeat the old pattern. The main lesson is simple and terrifying at once. War is always a choice, and the price of this choice is human life. Every city, every street, every child, these are not numbers. This is meaning that must be protected. And while the question, what was all this for, remains unanswered, this meaning will again and again end up on the scales of others' interests.